People are always asking me about cheap chisels for the Woodwork for Humans series. They want the same kind of ultra-cheap tools that we usually use around here. And a lot of my colleagues like the Aldi chisels, which are sold by a discount grocery chain and cost like $12 or something ludicrous like that. I'd be happy to review them, but Aldi hasn't had these in stock for like 2 years. But something interesting started happening recently. I started seeing a lot of inexpensive chisels on Amazon, and they looked an awful lot like the Aldi chisels. Same bevel edge design, same cone-shaped neck. They've even got identical skinny wooden handles with those weird flat spots milled into the front and that useless hoop on the end. The Aldi chisels had ash handles, and these lookalikes have handles made from softer woods like beech, but this seems like a tiny detail. Since there are a lot of companies slapping their names on these tools, I just went with the cheapest ones I could find. They're made by Gribstick. Gribstick? Gribstick. Whatever. These things were $18 with free shipping. And at that price, I would have bought them if they were made by the Russian mafia. They came in a totally decent plastic sheath with little edge protectors on each blade, and they even threw in this zippered pouch. I was kind of impressed. At this price, I wasn't even really expecting a cardboard box. I mean, I thought some guy was just gonna ride past my house on a bicycle and throw them at me. I mean, for God's sakes, they were $18. This video is going to be a review of these cheap chisels and a tutorial on how to make the London pattern chisel handle. If you're just here for the handles, feel free to skip ahead in the video. For everybody else, let's take a look at these budget wonders. Right off the jump, these are pretty well manufactured tools, with good machining, but a very mediocre rough ground finish, and super sharp edges all along the tool. That's fine, because it's all fixable, and the prep work for affordable chisels is pretty much the same no matter what you buy. The backs of the chisels need to be flat and polished, and I've seen people spend hours doing this on sharpening stones or diamond stones, but I start off with 220 grit sandpaper glued to glass. It's a lot faster. Keep the chisel flat and give it firm, downward pressure as you work it back and forth. Obviously, 220 won't give you a final surface. It's just for rough leveling. Once I've got the back mostly clean, I switch to 400 grit and do the same thing. 400 is also a good grit for breaking sharp edges and taking down rough grinding marks. The transition from the neck to the blade is also much too rough, but a few minutes with a file and a bit of sandpaper takes off all the machining marks and rounds over the edges at all the places where I would handle the tool. After I've worked the rough spots, I've got a tool that feels smooth and comfortable in the hand. This is something I can hold all day. With the basic work done, I move over to my affordable Woodwork for Humans sharpening rig. The whole thing costs less than $50, and I've got a whole video that I will link to down in the description. At the stones, I continue to flatten and polish the backs, and then just go through the normal honing and stropping of each edge. The finished tool looks and feels nice, but that doesn't mean anything. Here's a piece of reclaimed Douglas fir. My chisel slices cleanly through it with almost no effort. This is just a soft wood, but a bad edge would crush the fibers and leave a dull, ragged surface. This chisel left a cleanly sliced surface with shimmery grain, just like a good hand plane. An even better test is end grain, which is pretty squishy in softwood. It takes a fine, hard edge to slice across those unsupported fibers and make a flat surface. But so far, this chisel looks completely decent. Now, let's chop a quick mortise and give that chisel some good hard hits with the mallet. If the steel isn't good, the edge will chip or roll over when it chops. We're going to pound through some wood, and then test the edge again without resharpening. Honestly, these initial results look pretty good. There's no substitute for testing these chisels over several months of actual furniture building, but for now, they look good enough to deserve a little extra work. My only real complaint with these tools is the handles. Beech is a perfectly respectable wood, but these handles feel suspiciously light and flimsy. That little hoop in the end isn't doing anything, and even a few blows from the mallet seems to be crushing the end. Having a tool handle break in the middle of a project is an enormous drag, so I think we'll just replace these right now. Our new handles will be in the London pattern. It is a highly evolved, very ergonomic design. It's 8-sided where you grip it, which gives you a lot of control. It has a domed end for striking, it's got a little depression for your thumb and forefinger to sit into. It's Wonderful. It's really kind of the gold standard, and you really never see it on modern production tools. Even on vintage tools, it is surprisingly rare. I have dozens of vintage chisels in this shop, and when I went looking for a London pattern, I couldn't find a single one. In fact, the only London pattern handle I have is on this old vintage screwdriver. But it's still a really good example. It's got that 8-sided design, very comfy grip, nice details. This isn't bad. And as I was looking at it, I couldn't help thinking, man, this looks awfully familiar. And I went and grabbed one of my Craftsman screwdrivers. And immediately I was like, holy crap, this is a London pattern handle. Seriously, 8 sides, domed end, nice depression for the thumb and forefinger to sit in. I've owned these since I was 15, and I never gave a moment's thought to the design of the handle. Probably because it works so well. And clearly, these are descended from London pattern chisel handles. Now this one here obviously isn't a chisel handle, but it's going to give us a great starting place for making new handles. Now don't drive yourself crazy looking for some ultra-hard exotic wood for your chisel handles. You shouldn't be hitting them that hard anyway. Beech is traditional, but the stuff we get in Ohio is a little bit soft. Ash is another good choice, and depending on your firewood pile, you might find Osage orange, dogwood, or persimmon. I'm using sugar maple, which is affordable and more than hard enough. Start by squaring up your blank. I found just under 1 1/8 inches to be a great size for my hands. With a good square blank, you want to set up a gauge for a little less than 1/3 of the stock's thickness, and run lines along all the edges. Grip your stock in a bar or pipe clamp for quick rotation and easy access to the corners. Use your scrub plane to get down close to your gauge lines, and then finish up with a finely set jack or smoothing plane. When your gauge lines just about disappear, you should have a nice, even octagon. But don't rely too much on your lines. This is handwork, so you need to be constantly looking at the shape and testing the feel with your hand. Don't work on autopilot. Now, let's get rid of those old handles. It's just a friction fit, so you can tap them off with a scrap of hardwood and a mallet. Don't throw out the old handles. They're perfectly good for files or other random tools, and having some handles ready to go can be a huge time saver. The tangs on these chisels are a stubby hexagon, nothing like a traditional forged tang, but they seem to work okay, so I'm not going to mess with them. A bigger issue is the ferrules. These prevent splitting, and I've seen tin foil that's thicker than these things. You can see me bending them just with finger pressure. Let's take a second and make something better. I want a pretty close match on the original diameter, and I found this cheap steel tubing in the scrap bin. It's thin, but it's still a huge improvement. After I sand off the paint, I can quickly hacksaw off the pieces that I need. The ends are very ragged, but our old friend sandpaper on glass takes care of those problems quickly. A lot of people use copper for this because it's so easy to work, but I really prefer the looks and strength of brass or steel. Use whatever you want, but consider pushing yourself to try a new material. Tool making is a good time to experiment, so you know what you're doing when you go to use these skills on an actual project. Over at the lathe, it's just a few moves to turn our octagonal stock into a handle. I've got calipers set for the inner diameter of my ferrule, and I'll turn that first. Then, I want a shallow depression for my thumb and a tight, round transition over to the tip. Once I cut off my extra stock, I can fine-tune the end and get a tight fit on the ferrule. Having the handle in the chuck makes it a snap to drill the hole for the tang. The perfect size for this hole is 11/32. How do I know? Dang it! Trust me. With all the other operations done, I can go to the back end, turn a little shoulder, and shape that split-resistant dome. It's important to save this operation for last, since you're weakening the wood right where it's being driven. Oh, and if you're interested in getting a lathe and learning how to turn, I wrote a book about that. It's called 1 Week to Wood Turning, and it's a complete guide to getting all of the equipment for wood turning and setting up a complete turning studio, quickly and on a budget. It's available on Amazon, or you can go to rexkruger.com/book. Back at the lathe, the end is done and you can saw off the waste. Shape that dome with a bit of sandpaper and fit the ferrule to the end. You want a tight friction fit, but it's easy to remove a bit too much material on the lathe. Here, I'm putting a couple drops of superglue in between the wood and the steel. It's still going to hold just fine. You should feel a fair bit of resistance as you drive the handle over the tang. That means you're getting a tight fit. With this pattern, it's crucial to have the top and bottom flats lined up with the faces of the chisel. This might take a bit of adjustment, but giving the handle a tiny turn left or right won't hurt anything, and your handle is pretty much done. Now, I know what you're thinking. Rex, that's all very nice, but I don't have a lathe. Well, that's no problem. See, we're working with this nice octagonal stock, which is not difficult to make by hand. And once you have something that's 8-sided, well, you just have to make a few round details on either end, and your handle is done. When you're starting with 8 sides, getting to that nice round section, it's really not difficult. The basic technique is you work down the corners of the octagon, and that gives you something that's 16-sided, even closer to a circle. Then when you round over those facets with sandpaper or a file, you can get something that's amazingly smooth, really close to what you would get on a lathe. We'll start by fitting the ferrule. You can find the center of your piece by just connecting the corners. Trace the ferrule and run a line around the outside of your handle for your depth. I'm going to use my fine Dozuki saw to make a stopped shoulder all the way around this end. I have a bit of tape on my blade that keeps me from going too deep. That shoulder I just made makes it safe for me to come around with a chisel and split off all the waste before carefully paring down to my line. A bit of file work takes off my facets, and I can just get my ferrule over the end. When I tap it down later, I'll get a tight fit, no need for any glue. Now I'll transition down to the end by staying on my flats and preserving that octagon. I'm using one of my new chisels, by the way, and it's working out great. You can do this work in a standard vise, but it's hard to beat a clamp for small, round objects where you want to rotate the work. I chisel down my corners to get 16 sides, and then refine the shape with a file. It starts out looking rough, but it's surprising how quickly you transition into something smooth and comfortable. The same basic techniques will let me form that thumb depression. A shallow stop cut in the middle makes it safe for me to come in from both sides and carve down that little hollow. I'm always cutting downhill toward the cut, so there's no danger of splitting the work. A half-round file is convenient for smoothing things out, but you can also wrap sandpaper around a dowel. That works just as well. For a final finishing trick, take a narrow strip of sandpaper and drag it back and forth, as if you're polishing with a cloth. It's almost as good as using a lathe. Finally, I'll cut my last shoulder around the butt end, trace a diameter, and split off the waste. I still haven't sharpened this chisel since the video started, and it's still cutting great. Working the corners of the handle lets me transition smoothly from the grip to the end. I need to make that split-resistant dome, and that's much easier using my Mora Sloyd knife. This is a super handy tool, and I will link to it down in the description, along with all the other tools from this build. Now, I'm back to my strip of sandpaper to smooth out that round shape, and this pale maple has picked up a lot of dirt and crud while I was working with it, so I'm just going to scrape all those flats clean again. Now, the last thing we need to do to the handle is drill that hole for the tang to go into. And this can be kind of a tense moment because we have put a lot of work into this handle. If that hole is off even by a couple of degrees, the chisel will be really crooked and all that work is going to be ruined. So we're going to take a bunch of precautions and make sure this hole comes out perfect on the first try. I've got my modern brace, which has a 3-jaw chuck and really grips twist bits effectively. I'm also putting my wedding ring over the bit. This is an old cabinet maker's trick for knowing when your bit is level. If your ring doesn't slide forward or back, then you're on level, and you can watch from the top to make sure your bit is straight side to side. I need a fairly large hole for the chisel, and big holes are hard to start using twist bits in end grain wood, so I'm drilling a pilot hole with a narrow bit first. I'm also going to rotate my handle 180 degrees partway through the drilling. Flipping the work cancels out any potential error. If the pilot hole is good, then it's very difficult to go wrong when you're drilling the final hole. The bit will always follow the path of least resistance, but I use the ring and flip the stock anyway. Now, that was a lot of work to drill one hole correctly, but it came out perfectly, so I don't mind. Here's another way you could do it. If you're trying to fit a tool handle to a chisel, you could start with a piece of oversized stock like this. Drill the hole first, seat the chisel in, and then hold it by the chisel in the vise while you carve the handle around the chisel. That way, you've already got the chisel in there, and if it's a little crooked or off-center, you can adjust that as you're carving this stock down to your final shape. You're not going to end up with a crooked final product because you can always be adjusting and you have the axis of that chisel to guide you. That's a really legitimate way of doing this by hand and probably an even more traditional method. Now, I already had this octagonal stock, so I decided to do it the riskier way. You can do it either way, doesn't make a huge difference. And I bet you're sitting there right now thinking, well, you did a pretty good job on that handle, but how does it compare to the ones you turned on the lathe? Well, here's one of the turned handles, and here's the one I carved. Does the hand-carved one measure up? I'll let you be the judge. And we saw how quickly that maple gets dirty in the shop environment, but chisel handles also don't work well with a heavy film finish. So here's a good trick. Wipe-on polyurethane is thin and really soaks into the wood. If you only put on one coat, it won't build up a slick finish, but it will still seal that grain and keep out most of the dirt. I'm laying extra finish on that thirsty end grain at the top and brushing a little bit on those steel ferrules for rust protection. Poly is actually a great finish for bare steel, and it's durable. Okay, so why did we go through all the trouble to make this complex handle shape? Well, a lot of reasons. If you close up your hand like this, you can see that's not really a circle. It's much more like an octagon shape, and this handle slides right in there perfectly. Because it has these flats, it can't twist in your grip. Any way that you put it down on the bench, it stays that way. Not only is this thing not going to roll, but it's also going to stay however you leave it. So when you go back to pick it up, it'll be in the exact same position that you left it. This handle is also registered to the chisel. So these flats here correspond to the top and back of the blade. When you've got your thumb on one of the flats, you know exactly where the flat of the blade is. This depression here is perfect for your thumb and forefinger to sit into, and that gives you a great grip for paring. And while you're holding it that way, this butt end, which is dome-shaped to prevent splitting, fits right into the hollow at the heel of your hand. That gives you outstanding grip and control for paring. You can get lots of power. And when you have to switch things around and strike the chisel with the mallet, you can take your middle finger and roll it around that depression, put the rest of your hand around the chisel, your thumb goes straight along the handle, again on one of those flats, and the handle is long enough that when you come in with the mallet and give it a tap, your thumb is well out of the way. This is a highly evolved shape that'll really handle everything you need to do with a chisel. It's worth it to make something like this. So, I admit, I've got a pretty good feeling about these chisels. I think they're going to work out. They've worked out in all my tests, but it's only been a couple of days. To really know whether these things are going to be up to the standards of good, affordable tools we have around here, I'm going to have to use them for a few weeks or a month. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to use them every day for a while, and then I will come back to you and give you an update review. In the meantime, you might be thinking, well, heck, they're 18 bucks. I'll buy a set and give them a try. That sounds fine to me. I will link to them down in the description. You might also be thinking, hey, that London pattern handle, that looks pretty good. I want to put that on some of my tools. What are the, sizes and everything? Well, I've got a complete measured drawing that has all the lengths, diameters, and details that you need to duplicate this pattern. And usually I charge for stuff like that, but it's the holidays, so I'm going to give it away for free. Just go to rexkruger.com/store, and I've put the drawing right there in the top row where you can't miss it. While you're at my store, you might notice that all of my plans are 50% off. This is a new thing. I've never had a sale like this before, and I've made all of my plans half off just for the holiday season, with no limits, and you can even buy my plan bundles. The thing about being a woodworker is that sometimes you don't get what you want for Christmas. So you might as well buy yourself a little gift. I'm only going to do this sale in the month of December. And while we're talking about gifts, I really want to shout out my patron Zarquil. He made this beautiful mallet and presentation box for his nephew. He did a great job, cut dovetails for the first time, and he shared the whole thing with us over on my Patreon discussion forum. It is definitely one of the best woodworking forums on the internet, and it is definitely the friendliest and the most welcoming to beginners. If you'd like to be part of the fantastic discussions that we have on that board, go on over to patreon.com/RexKruger and check out the discussion forum, early access to videos, free plans, exclusive content, and all the other stuff I do to help out the people who make this stuff possible. And hey, this has been, it's still kind of a crazy holiday. I hope everybody's doing really well. I will be back next week with more woodworking madness. Thanks so much for watching.